Good morning, and thank you for joining our Spotify loveAudio session, Creativity You Cannot See, live from the mostly deserted Spotify Sydney HQ. Today we want to show you the creativity that you can't see and how digital audio can be put to work for your brands and clients. My name is Matt Bryant, Creative Solutions at Spotify, and I'll be speaking to you this morning, joined by our Global Creative Director, Rich Frankel, dialing in from his bolt hole in upstate Maine in the US. But before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. If you could please keep your mics and cameras switched off, that would be a great help. But we do want to hear from you today. We'll be holding an audience Q&A at the end of the session, so please contribute any questions via the chat box in Zoom. Secondly, in addition to your questions, we'd like it if you could contribute to our Zoom poll, answering the question, do you or your brands currently create audio with digital environments in mind? And we'll revisit the poll at the end of the session. So let's look at what we're going to talk about today, today's playlist. First of all, we want to set the scene, kind of set up the audience and talk to you about how there's a very significant audience of people listening to digital audio across Australia and New Zealand. We'll then bring in Rich from the US to conduct a little Q&A, and then get into creativity you cannot see and how you can produce great digital audio, rounding things out with an audience Q&A. So again, please do contribute those questions throughout the presentation in the Zoom chat box. So how are we listening? Streaming is now mainstream. People are streaming more audio than ever, and listening has doubled since 2012. Listening is also at scale. In Australia, according to Nielsen, there are 15.6 million people who are listening to digital audio every month, and we couldn't find quite an authoritative stat for New Zealand, but we think the number is somewhere in the region of 3 million. And that's not just Spotify, that's the entire kind of landscape as well. People are also listening to a range of different digital services. So this is a bit of a landscape, if you like. On the left, the digital players like Spotify and SoundCloud, radio networks like Nine, ARN, SCA in New Zealand, NZME, and MediaWorks, plus the national broadcaster. And then on the right-hand side, a whole range of different podcast services. Acast, the Swedish player, Podcast One, but Pandora not here anymore. So there is a huge amount of content that people can listen to. Talking specifically about Spotify, we are now at some serious scale. So 9.6 million people in Australia every month listening to the service, and 1.3 million people in New Zealand listening to Spotify as well. Now, the question that we always get is how many of these people get ads? In media and marketing, we have a habit of creating the ads and then doing our best to never see or hear them. People in media and marketing tend to pay for premium. However, that is not a reflection of the population. Globally, Spotify has 286 million listeners every month and 130 million pay. That's 55% on the free tier. And locally, we see a similar split between free and premium, weighted in favor of people receiving advertising. So do not think that Spotify is a premium-only platform because you pay. Overwhelmingly, people receive advertising, and that's what we're here to talk about this morning. Those people are listening longer, 2.5 hours per day per user on Spotify, and the way that we get to that number is through connected devices. You can listen on Spotify from your wrist, from your TV, from your bedside table. Samsung sell a fridge if you want a playlist from the door of the fridge. If you got the money, good for you. Streaming is very ubiquitous, and that means we have people listening for an extraordinarily long time every day. What we really want to talk about today, though, is a behavior change. Listening behavior has changed, and it is a generational change. What you're looking at there is a pretty cool looking boombox, but what it represents is kind of, well, it does represent the past. People used to listen to audio in a very linear fashion. They would get on the commute with the radio, maybe they'd have the radio playing all throughout the day in a linear fashion. That has changed. We think of this as non-linear listening. People don't tune in all day. They curate listening based on different moments to complement what they're doing. The cool boombox has been replaced with things like the Google Home, where you're now competing to be heard from a range of different services. To give a precedent, we've already seen this in video. Appointment television isn't really a thing anymore. You can binge. But beyond that, mostly people tune into TV when and where they want. Netflix, the good example. The same thing has happened in audio. And we're going to tell you a bit about that today based on what we saw in the recent or not recent, the still ongoing COVID crisis. We already knew that people used audio to complement a range of different moments. Fitness is a good one. The gyms have now reopened in New Zealand and New South Wales at least, and when they closed in March, we saw a 309% increase in people looking for F45 playlists on Spotify. If you're a CrossFitter, you weren't far behind. 220% increase in people looking for CrossFit content to work out. That's predictable. What's less predictable is the mundane and the boring. Housework up 50% in Australia in March. People seeking out music like the cleaning kit playlist to complement some really mundane kind of activities, reinforcing this idea that people think, what am I doing? Can audio complement this moment? To that end, a 72% increase in people seeking out family-themed music on Spotify in early May. Why? Audio is a good way to keep children entertained. The kids are at home, they're not at school. And children's music was the biggest genre increase, meta-genre increase, that we saw over the last few months. We also know that audio provides an escape. We live in a very heavily saturated world when it comes to both media and advertising. Surveys that we've done here and globally saw 56% of people agreeing that audio provides an escape from too much visual stimulation because audio is a good way to disconnect and relax from the world around you. To that end, chill was already the number one moment on Spotify when we look at commute, party, workout, sleep. Chill was already number one, and that only increased through the past few months. A 39% increase in searches for chill music in Spotify in March, because of course, audio is a great way of kind of calming down. And we see that in the data. To come back to the fridges and the TVs and all that, we've seen some very significant increases in device consumption over the last few months. Again, coming back to this idea that people don't listen in a linear way anymore. They decide where they want to listen, for what purpose, and they curate their experience. It isn't programmed for them. 43% increase in gaming consoles, PlayStation and Xbox. Both consoles where advertisers can speak to gamers about their product. Smart speakers, you'd expect, and we saw. TVs, desktop had a moment as well, and tablets hanging in there too. So, podcasting. Podcasting is a very hot topic. We have seen a very significant increase in year-on-year listening. 250% increase is our global stat for Spotify, and we're going to continue to invest in this area. You likely saw the news about Joe Rogan not that long ago. You may not have seen the news overnight about Kim Kardashian West. We've done a deal with Kim Kardashian West to produce a podcast exclusively on Spotify in conjunction with a legal not-for-profit called the Innocence Project. By the way, there's a good documentary on Netflix about the Innocence Project. It's a not-for-profit intended to free wrongly convicted criminals, although they're not criminals, are they? So that will be coming to the surface shortly, and just further evidence that we can continue to dig into this podcasting space. So what does this all mean? There's a really significant audience, millions of people across Australia and New Zealand listening to digital audio. We understand today the mood and mindset, the context of the listener based on the playlists and the moments that they're consuming. This intelligence, or as we put it, streaming intelligence, gives brands the ability to be heard in those moments, to have greater resonance, greater relevance for the listener. So with that, we're going to bring in Rich, our global CD. And before we get Rich's face on the screen, I'm just going to read you a little bio about Rich so we don't embarrass him. Richard Frankel's nearly 40-year career spans entertainment, marketing, and technology. As Global Creative Director at Spotify, Rich focuses on the development of great digital and real-world experiences for users and brand partners. Rich was executive producer at Ogilvy Entertainment, creating branded content for IBM, Cisco, and Kraft. He was manager at Think New Ideas, a Web 1.0 agency that developed 360 campaigns for Oracle, the LA Philharmonic, and others. He produced award-winning TV specials, 2 of which featured the artist Sting, receiving 8 Emmy nominations and 4 wins. Rich ran creative services at A&M Records, where he executive produced scores of music videos, including Grammy winners Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, which you heard in the introduction, and Sting's 10 Summoner's Tales, as well as multiple MTV VMA Awards. And finally, prior to A&M, Rich was creative director on the original team at Warner Amex that launched and marketed MTV, Nickelodeon, and the Movie Channel. We got there. Welcome, Rich Frankel.
Good morning, Matt. How are you?
I'm good, Rich. It's very nice to be in an office.
Imagine. I'm sitting here in northern New England in the United States where the sun is actually setting behind me here, but I'm pleased to see that you guys already have tomorrow underway, and I'm happy to be joining you.
Welcome to the future, Rich. So let's get into some questions. And to begin, I just want to bring a quote onto the screen. See if we can get that up here. Quote, there it is. So this is a quote from a book that may be familiar to some of you. The book is called Hey Whipple Squeeze This, which was a guide to creating great ads. It was actually written in the 90s, but it's still relevant today. And in it, Luke Sullivan wrote, in audio, the canvas is large, stretching off in every direction. Audio lets you do impossible things way too expensive to make into TV commercials. So with that quote in mind, Rich, you've spent a lot of your career working with high-profile artists, particularly in video. What is it about audio that represents a valuable creative opportunity for brands?
Well, I think that one of the things we've seen happen, one of the things that's changed when I think about the artists that I've worked with, is that, that Rhythm Nation song, that Janet Jackson song that we just listened to, was made in a recording studio with a lot of producers and engineers and a tremendous amount of equipment. And it was a very expensive place to rent and work in. And it took them months to make it. And it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to make. And it was a big hit. We knew that Janet was going to be a big success. We were thrilled to be able to put that record into the marketplace. But the landscape has changed dramatically across production. It happened in video. And we've all felt the effects of that in video. As video, the playing field has been leveled in terms of how easy it is to produce video. But it's very dramatically happened in audio. And when you think about the fact that last year, this Billie Eilish record that took the world by storm was made basically in her bedroom with her brother and her just working at home to make that entire record, it gave a good example of just how significant the sea change has been in terms of production. So we've opened up the ability for massive numbers of creators to now work and to make original audio on the platform. The other trend that I think that we have to acknowledge is something that you just spoke about in one of your slides, which is this idea of escapism in your slide, talking about people now finding their opportunities to move away from all of the screen time that we're constantly barraged with. And we're in a situation now worldwide with everything happening over Zoom as we are now, that we're more and more involved in screen time. But there are these moments that are screenless, that people are using audio to really fill out and to soundtrack and to either regulate the sounds in the background of their moments or to amplify them in the case of a workout, for instance. So, I always talk about the notion of how powerful audio can be, but these screenless moments are something that we're really paying a lot of attention to now.
Okay, so to establish there's this huge canvas to create. For the people on the line, what's the first thing you'd say to creatives who started with digital audio ads for the very first time?
Well, I think one of the things you've got to really start to think about is, I guess this is probably the last thing a creative wants to hear, but I would just say, learn to listen. Think about listening and what listening means and what it entails, and how an individual is using that moment to let an audio input define what they're doing or enhance what they're doing. I think that's really that's the biggest difference between creating for intimate digital audio, for streaming audio, versus the formats that you may know so well already, like television or radio or any of the things that you're familiar with doing on a regular basis.
Okay, and kind of the same question. So same question, slightly different angle. So for the brands on the line this morning, what would you say to brands who are new to audio and looking to get started?
I would say you're not new to audio. You may not have thought about it discreetly. You may not have thought about digital audio as a thing, but you've had experience with audio. If you made a television spot, in my view, the most important part of that spot is the soundtrack. Like, I made all those videos for years at A&M Records. And what would those have been is if we spent all of this money on these great directors making these beautiful films, but without the song standing behind it, those videos would have been nothing. And I believe that's the case with almost everything you watch, that the sound is so much more powerful than people realize. It's a subliminal kind of effect that it has on you. So I always think that for people who have made videos, digital video, TVCs, that they should remember a fair amount of time people have actually encountered those videos without watching them. They've been off in the distance, the TV's been on, and they have perhaps heard the sound and not seen it. And one thing you have to remember is it's easy to close your eyes and block out the visual world, but it's impossible to close your ears. You just can't do that. You're always taking audio input. Even if you've chosen to cancel out audio, that's something you've deliberately done. But you are always taking input in the audio realm.
Okay. So talking a little bit more about brands. So, I often encounter people that see a barrier to digital audio because the differences between radio and digital are not well understood. And frankly, there are differences of context and style, but it's not an insurmountable task. What would you say are the three key differences to remember when creating for a digital listener as against what brands may be familiar and comfortable with in radio?
Yeah, well, I think there are some big differences here. First of all, I just love how much smarter streaming digital audio is than radio, or even downloadable audio. Streaming digital audio is it's kind of like a PhD, and radio is more like a preschooler. It's usually loud, and it's not always relevant. And the fact is that it's not its fault. It just doesn't have the capabilities to be as relevant as streaming audio can be. The first thing you have to remember is we have this big audience of 280 some million people on Spotify. But that's not really an audience. That's 280 million relationships of one-to-one. That is each one of those users curating their own experience and deciding what they listen to, as you just described in those slides. They're intentionally programming moments in their lives, and they're picking that music. So we hear people talking about Spotify. They say, I opened my Spotify. And that is a great sign. That means they understand that they're curating this experience with us. And that makes our ability to target those individuals so much more exquisite, because we can understand their moment of intent, what they're about to do or what they've just done. We know what they're listening to. We understand how they're using music in their day. And it gives us the opportunity to program advertising that is in sync with the cadence of their lives. Radio just can't do that. Radio has this big wash of broadcast that lets you reach a tremendous amount of people, but you really don't have any idea whether they've heard it or whether they've heard it in a moment that it resonates. We have a much better opportunity to make sure that we close those loops in a way that is truly relevant to each individual on the platform.
Yeah, one of the techniques that I used to see a few years ago in audio scripts was it would always start with "Hey Spotify" or "Hey Spotify." This idea that you have to be like, "I'm over here," which is very much a radio technique. You don't have to shout. You don't have to really cut through. In some ways, you've been invited in.
That's
research
the
that we've done.
I mean, you've got these headphones on. It's an intimate, personal experience. You trust the service because you've been part of building the programming that you're listening to. You've invited the advertiser in. If you're on our free tier, that's part of the deal. You have agreed to listen to advertising, and you're fine with that as part of the experience of monetizing the artist that you love. So you've basically been invited in. The last thing you should do is shout, "Hey, I'm over here. We know you're over here. We invited you into this conversation with us. Now tell us something we want to hear."
Yeah, they expect to hear from you. So all really good points. Thank you for joining this portion of the Q&A. Rich will be coming back in a moment to join our audience Q&A. So please do contribute questions in the Zoom chat box, as well as answering that poll, which we'll come back to. So moving right along, gonna get to the creativity you cannot see now. So Rich said you can close your eyes, but you cannot close your ears. We want you to close your eyes right now and take a listen to this little reel about kind of listening in context.
Hi, do you mind if I sit?
Apologies, guys. We're just having a little
So
back-end
you're
difficulty
considering
here, queuing the
advertising with
track.
digital audio. Smart. Media agencies around the world are increasing their digital audio advertising budgets right now. In Australia alone, 8 in 10 agencies have either used or intend to use ads within music streaming services. That's huge. But what's the reason behind this? In a marketplace cluttered with screens, advertising with digital audio provides a rare opportunity to cut through all the noise. It enables you to find your customers with selective targeting, and then once you're in their ears, lets you forge an emotional connection. I love this song! But you want to know the trick? You need to use purpose-fit creative that suits the listener's environment, with storytelling and by harnessing the power of audio to activate the listener's senses. Let me show you something. Take a look behind here. A lush rainforest teeming with wildlife. And let's have a look behind door number 2. An urban street packed with pedestrians. And here, waves crashing on a deserted beach. You can take listeners anywhere in the world, immerse them in any moment, make them feel. Find out all the places you can go with Spotify.
It's morning.
We'll cut that one off there. So let's move along now to creating digital audio, how you can get involved and how you can start to create with techniques which are really specific to digital. So moving right along, context. Probably said it 50 times this morning. You have context in digital audio because everyone on Spotify is a unique user ID. We understand their music taste. We understand their interest as a consumer. So you can create for context. And when brands use different first and third party segments, we do see an increase in awareness and intent among listeners. So you can appear in these real-time moments and create for the context to be heard in that moment. The example I want to show you here is for Schweppes in Australia. This is the best thing I've heard in ages. Schweppes, as many of you will know, have had that Schweppevescence brand platform for a number of years, all about refreshment and effervescent bubbles. And Schweppes and their creative agency TBWA produced some really rich sound design, which was designed to complement our ASMR sleep sounds playlist. Now, if you don't know what ASMR is, it's basically hearing something and it causing an involuntary physical response, like goosebumps, for example. So Schweppes sponsored our ASMR Sleep Sounds playlist, and we'll play you a spot now, which drove people on the free platform in Australia through to that playlist full of really soothing sounds to sleep or to relax.
Click or tap the banner to immerse yourself in ASMR sleep sounds, courtesy of Schweppes. Lay back, relax, and fall asleep to a mix of soothing whispers and ASMR trigger sounds. Have you experienced Schweppevescence?
So it's very subtle, some nice fizzy effects there. This is sound design, and we're going to come back to Schweppes in just a moment. Headphone listening means your audience can appreciate the sound that you're putting down, which is very different from a kind of broadcast medium. Overwhelmingly, people on Spotify are listening with headphones. I'm sure many of you are listening with headphones right now. What that means is what I just said. People can appreciate the sound design, and research that we've done behind the campaigns that use rich sound design have shown a significant increase in click-through compared to standard audio spots, which is kind of interesting when you consider that audio is still considered an awareness medium, and yet in digital, it's actionable. And we see greater action where you immerse with sound design. So coming back to Schweppes, the spot you heard a moment ago drove people through to that ASMR Sleep Sounds playlist presented by Schweppes. And then we surround the listener experience with advertising from the sponsor. And instead of doing something very copy heavy, talking about, a retail offer or something like that, what Schweppes did is they used really rich sound design to create something that, if it were heard in that playlist, would seem highly contextual and also have really great sound design. So I'll play you that spot now.
Immerse yourself in Schweppes essence. Have you experienced Schweppes essence?
So again, combine contextual creative with great sound design. This is a really excellent campaign. So moving on, sonic branding. Well, what's that? It's that. I don't need to tell you that. Maybe now you know what you're having for lunch. Sonic branding is McDonald's, Intel, VB have a great jingle. You'll also hear it known as like a sting or an audio signature. And sonic branding is becoming increasingly important because, as Rich mentioned, we've got people in what we call screenless moments. Some data from the IAB indicated that 79% of audio consumption takes place where consumers are engaged in activities where visual media can't reach them. Imagine you're back in the office, it would be nice. You've got your spreadsheet or your email open, you're listening to audio, you can't be hit with display, you're not getting video, there's probably not a billboard in your office. This is a moment where you can only be reached with audio. Adding sonic branding adds another layer of connection and cut through. And there are brands who we're familiar with this. I mentioned McDonald's, Intel, Xbox. Westpac is a brand who we've seen recently come over to this space using the sound of the iconic Westpac Rescue helicopter, the rotor blades, as a really subtle, but I think really nice sonic brand, a kind of a sign-off. You'll see this in their TV, and you would have also heard it on Spotify in a recent campaign. So an excellent example of brands coming over to this space, and in this instance, using an existing brand asset to build that sonic signature. Visa and HSBC are another couple of financial services companies who have developed sonic brands in the last 12 to 18 months, and we do expect to see more advertisers come over as people get more difficult to hit with visual media. So moving along, and we're nearly there, I promise. Let's talk a little bit about dynamic, because dynamic is kind of like a further step forward. We've had dynamic display for a better part of a decade, dynamic video more recently. You can now do dynamic audio, which is dynamic creative with a human voice, and it doesn't sound like Siri, which I mean it doesn't sound like shit. So listeners' interests and attitudes can change, we think, depending on their circumstances. So why not tailor your advertising to change based on the listener's context? And I'll show you an example now that may be familiar to some of you because I've certainly presented it a lot. This was for Unilever, for Weiss, over the summer of 2019. This was a campaign that we created with 20,600 potential 30-second spots. So that's not about chaining a voiceover artist to a booth and getting them to record 20,000 30s. You record 30 different messages for 30 different locations around Australia, messages for the day of week, the time of day, the weather in those locations, and then through programmatic targeting, you identify the listener and serve them a spot which is customized in real time. I'll play you the ad now. See if you can hear where the different segments are stitched together, because this is 30 seconds of sound, but it's actually 5 distinct files all together at once.
What will make this a perfect Tuesday morning? A great setting. You can't get better than beautiful Melbourne, can you? Some cracking weather. Well, this sunshine puts everyone in a good mood. And the irresistible combination of real Aussie mangoes and rich ice cream in a refreshing Weiss bar. Perfect. Now for a catchy tune to round it out. Weiss bars, made in Australia with love and real fruit since 1957.
One other interesting application of dynamic audio is music bed matching. We understand what people are listening to in real time, so we do have the ability to call in a rock, pop, indie, electronic, whatever it is, music bed to dynamically appear behind your message to make that message more seamless, which I think is a really nice touch. In fact, Pizza Hut were the first to do dynamic and that technique in Australia as many as 4 years ago now. So I've had this for a little while. And the last one here is disrupt the format. So audio ads on Spotify can be up to 30 seconds in duration. We think you should take the time you need, not the time that you have. And we're not precious about that. You can have a message of most any duration. We're going to play you an example here for Marie Claire from France, and there is a content warning as the case study does concern the subject of domestic violence. And the purpose of this campaign was to draw attention to the issue. And it really is an excellent example of disrupting the format. Because as they say, sometimes silence is actually louder than words.
I got broads in Atlanta. Do you love me? Never over.
Loud Silence by Marie Claire. A silent ad that uses silence to draw attention. For the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the French magazine Marie Claire tricked free Spotify users to deliver its message with a silent 30-second ad that forced them to take their phones out of their pockets and drove them to a full report on the acts of violence against women, combining stories of women of all ages who have suffered violent acts and were willing to show that it's always better to talk. At this point, silence turned into noise and generated a lot of user conversations. Silence was their biggest enemy. It became their strongest weapon.
So that concludes the main part of our presentation. We now want to move into the audience Q&A and also take a look at the poll. Could we call the poll, please? Oh, just jumped ahead a little there. We just get the poll up on the screen. Calling Mr. Poll. There we go. So we asked you, do you or your brand currently create audio with digital environments in mind? And it looks like we've had somewhere in the order of 60 respondents, and it's kind of even in some ways. So 37% of respondents said yes, 19% no, 39% sometimes, and a couple of people unsure. Well, that is interesting. And let's get Rich back on the screen now and look at some audience questions. Welcome back, Rich.
Good to be back.
If we could get the questions up on the screen, please. All right. So let's look at these. So let's start the question. So dynamic audio sounds amazing, but it seems very complicated to do. How can brands produce dynamic audio and what are the costs? So it's actually not a high barrier to entry at all. Dynamic audio takes about 2 to 3 weeks to produce, and we can do it in a couple of different ways. Spotify can either produce dynamic creative, owning it in-house. We've also collaborated with creative agencies like Leo Burnett and Ogilvy, where the creative agency owns the scripting and we consult on that basis and record. Production costs depend upon how many kind of variables you want, but it tends to be anywhere in the order of 3,000 to 8,000. So it's not a high barrier to entry, and again, we play a very consultative role. Nigel Dalton asked, where do books like Audible, etc., sit amongst the forms of streaming audio like news, podcasts, and music? Outside those 15.6 million user numbers, a media for Spotify for sure. So I'll throw to Rich on this in a moment, but audiobooks there's a good anecdote about audiobooks, because Spotify's move into podcasting actually came out of Germany, and it was almost by accident, although don't quote me. One label had ingested a lot of audiobook spoken word content into the catalog in Germany, and we saw people start to listen to this, and we couldn't really account for why at first. And then we saw people consuming this content that I think at the time we may not have even known that we had. And from there, we kind of built and have continued to build into podcasting. I don't think that audiobooks in the way that Audible does it is something which is currently within our strategy. I think definitely podcasts. It's going to be podcast first. Rich, can you shed any light on that question?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting situation, because in each market there are different rights pictures that either allow us to have audiobooks on the platform, which we do in Germany, or to or not be able to have them. But there's some interesting hybrids that we've seen happening now. Like just recently, we've had the original cast from the Harry Potter movie reading the original first book of the Harry Potter series. And that was something that they wanted to do as something to deliver to a young audience during the COVID crisis. So there would be something engaging for them to listen to at home. So, and I think that the response to that has been so great that we're going to see more and more people think about what do they currently publish, whether it be in print or an audiobook format, that might want to think about a podcast format as a way of distributing as well. We could be just become an extension of that audiobook landscape, because the podcast piece of Spotify is growing so quickly.
Okay, another question here from Nigel, although I promised everyone else we will get to your questions. So Nigel asked, accepting the power of audio, does Spotify have plans to capture some of the video audience as well? So 2 points there. So on the advertising side of things, Spotify does have a video ad product, one of which is an opt-in, where if you watch a brand's video, you receive 30 minutes of uninterrupted listening. In terms of content, we've experimented with video in a number of ways over the years. Some of our biggest playlists have video within them. These are videos from artists and sort of behind the scenes or documentary style content. And most recently, we've actually been testing vodcasting. Joe Rogan is a really good example. My experience of watching Joe Rogan was exclusively on YouTube. I wanted to see Joe. I didn't want to listen, right? I wanted to have the video experience. So the vodcasting piece is something which we're actually have been testing, and I think we'll be launching with Joe. Rich, anything to add there about harnessing the power of that video audience?
No, other than to say that is an active alpha test that we have going right now. We have had requests from podcasters to be able to enhance what they're talking about with images of either video or other stills or whatever they want to put on top of their audio tracks. And the Joe Rogan deal is driving it. You're absolutely right. I mean, we have until the end of this year when his deal with YouTube will end, and we'll have him exclusively on Spotify starting next year. And at that point, I think those people who are used to watching him like you on video are going to want to continue to be able to do that. So we'll make efforts to make sure that is working on the platform at that point.
So a question here from Jasper. How many Australians currently subscribe to premium versus free? So we see globally the split is 55% on the free tier. That's 130 million paid and 156 million free. And we see a similar number in this market as well. One of the misconceptions about premium is that it's only the affluent who have it, or it's the younger people who have it. This isn't true. A person's likelihood to subscribe to Spotify Premium is very dependent on their relationship with music. Students will spend the money that they have, which is certainly less than other people, to pay for Spotify because they value the experience so much. So about 55% on the free tier, and there's no correlation between having premium with being affluent or anything else. Will Bate asked, how much is a rich sound ad to make like Schweppes? So production with our audio partner here in Sydney, Made in Katana, for a rich or 3D audio ad is roughly $2,500. That's about twice as much as a standard spot. However, we can also produce multiple scripts in a scalable way. So it's not a wildly expensive thing to do. So that quote from Luke Sullivan, you can do things in audio which would be unfathomably expensive to do in video, and it's not a terribly costly thing to do at all. So anonymous attendee asked, that's interesting, my brand works mostly with the sense of sight. Our products don't make a sound. What good examples do you have of times where brands have tried to convey colors through sound?
I don't know.
While I think about
if
that,
we have
Rich on the spot.
I do have one thing that I think would be an interesting thing to talk about. It's not exactly color, but there was a campaign that was run on Spotify in Brazil where a company that made cookware was interested in breaking down taste and smell and correlating those senses with appropriate sounds. And they went and brought neurological consultants in, and they broke down the ingredients in hundreds of recipes to figure out what the actual appropriate match on the repertoire catalog of Spotify would be for each recipe that you might want to cook in their cookware. And they built this beautiful campaign that took their favorite 50 recipes and built a playlist of the music that the ingredients and the processes of making that food represented in sound. So I think we probably could get to something that would do that with color more purely, and I think it would be a fantastic thing to try and figure out.
Yeah, the name escapes me, but there is technology that can look at an image and draw out its color, and then assign that to different musical attributes like intensity, even time signature. So there are ways that we can connect the visual with audio, although the name of that API escapes me right now. Question here from Ben. I think it's just kind of disappeared from my screen, but it basically amounted to, why is it that music can't be played in podcasts and it be treated as a play for the artist? Why must podcasts license music within the podcast itself? So just for some background, if you create a podcast and you want to play a licensed track, you do need to get the licensing for that, where I guess the essence of the question is that, it's on Spotify, why can't that be done? The answer is that podcasts and the music catalog are separate entities, and having one in the other does enter territory where licensing is currently required. One interesting thing I noticed, though, lately, actually reading a radio blog in Australia, some radio podcasters have started to create podcast playlists. So if you didn't know, about 6 months or more ago, we enabled people to create playlists which were a hybrid of podcast and audio content. Your Daily Drive is one such example of a Spotify playlist, which is curated for each listener. And what that radio podcaster has done is they've basically created a playlist which has their first segment, and then they play a track, they come back with another segment, and so on for the full duration. And for the listener, for the end user, it's a completely seamless experience. So although we don't have a way to, take into account the current situation with licensing, our platform does enable people to create what you've asked there, Ben, using the catalog of music. And those plays would count as plays for the rights holder.
I think one of the things I'd like to add to that is that we do work on the technology to be able to identify the music that exists in a podcast. The trickier part is going to be figuring out a way to make sure that the rights holders are comfortable with us reporting the use of those tracks inside of a podcast. It's a different kind of license we'd have to have, and I'm not sure how quickly we'll be able to get that. But what you're asking about is something that our podcast producers would love to be able to do as well. It's something we're always trying to innovate to build, better products for them as well.
Good point. So another question here. So music podcasts, video podcasts, what's the next big bet for Spotify? That's for you, Rich.
I don't know. I think this podcast bet is so young. It's in its early stages, and we really have so much to do and so much to go as we build this out. We are not fully in the markets we want to be in with it yet. We're test marketing the ability to understand how to dynamically insert ads in podcasts in a couple of markets, in Germany, in the UK, in the US, and that will be coming to Australia. And once that arrives in Australia, then you'll have the ability to really carefully target the advertising that goes into podcasts, and also to measure how well your ads are performing inside of podcasts. And that'll be a sea change. I think we have so much to do to build out the bets we've made already that I'm reticent to think about what we would take on next. But I'm really excited about what we're going to be able to do in the podcast landscape, because there's so much to do there.
To add to that and to answer the question, what's the next big bet? We do hear a lot about voice, and my personal opinion is that voice is cool, but it is kind of gimmicky, and scale is a concern. So you may have seen news at the start of this week where in the UK we've run a test with a cosmetics brand where people can talk back to their connected device in order to get a trial or a sample of a particular product. This is the second voice test that we've done in the last 18 months. The first was for Unilever, for Axe in the US, or Lynx, the deodorant as we know it locally. And in that instance, you heard an audio ad and you could say something to be taken to a playlist from Lynx or to a podcast about the story of The Clash, which was actually sponsored by Unilever. So we've done some testing in voice. I can give you some insight into what the challenges are with voice. One of the things is microphone permissions. So in order for this kind of talking back ad to work at scale, you need to have an audience who has authorized their mic. And that is proving to be a challenge. So I think to answer the question, what's a big bet? I don't think voice like that is going to be a bet, but it's definitely an area of interest. I think to Rich's point, podcasts are overwhelmingly our big bet, and it's a tremendous area of opportunity. So Rich, there's a question here that ends with "This one's for Rich," which during this Q&A is my favorite sentence. Anonymous attendee asked, "Our brand has an upbeat sting, but the product itself suits the chill, calm segment, which makes it conflicting from a brand delivery perspective. What do you think about that? A sting which is upbeat and yet at odds with the product, which seems more of a kind of chilled out thing."
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure we have to be that literal about it. I don't think that an upbeat sting is necessarily going to get in the way of a user's experience. I don't know how upbeat, how loud, how long it is, but there's no reason why you couldn't create a piece of audio where that sting is heard in the background or off in the distance and still is memorable and recognizable because it's so well developed in the culture. So it doesn't have, it's the way in which you choose to use the assets you have that can still make this kind of intimate, personal listening environment something that you're respecting with each of these users that you're talking to. I think that's a great creative challenge. And I'm sure that your agency is going to have a blast trying to figure that one out. And I think also the music that you use in a spot that you put against that sting is the kind of opportunity you have to find a way to make sure that it blends well into the message you're telling.
Another question here. AJ Clark asked, can we just get the questions back on the screen? Thank you. So AJ asked how many people subscribe. So we've already established that about 55% of people get advertising. That's a global number, but it's also roughly the same locally. AJ asks, how will you continue to serve audio ads to your audiences when free users start converting to paid? So free is a funnel to premium. We've seen that in every market the world over. People try the service, they want to get other features, and they pay. However, people do not inevitably convert to premium. This is something of a misconception. There is a particular kind of listener who doesn't want to pay for Spotify Premium because they're happy with a service where they can lean back, where they can get 50 million tracks and loads of podcasts and receiving some advertising. You can almost think of that person similar to a radio listener. So we're never going to have a problem in terms of scale. Even in places like the Nordics, where Spotify has been for a decade, everyone's not paying for the product. There are still people receiving advertising. One area where people will continue to receive audio ads, even if they are paying for the service, is within podcasts. That's not going to change. Rich, you're a bigger podcast guy than I am. I'm still a bit of a pretender. Maybe you want to talk about the role that advertising plays in the podcast landscape and how that's going to continue.
Well, I mean, there's a pretty massive tech development underway at Spotify in terms of how podcast advertising is served and measured. I mean, if you think about the history of podcasts, they've been around for quite a long time. There've always been ads in them. They've either been a 5 or 10 minute section in the middle of the thing where the podcast where the host is just riffing and talking about the products that are sponsoring his or her podcast. But the opportunity to get more specific about understanding audiences and understanding how to keep the advertising fresh in podcasts is something we've been looking at for quite some time. And just this past January at CES, we launched a streaming ad intelligence service, which allows us to swap out ads so that we are delivering podcasts to users with ads that are more relevant to them. And we're not letting ads that used to be hardwired into a podcast get old and dated and not be fresh as that podcast lives on in perpetuity. So this is a massive change in the way in which advertisers are looking at the entire podcast landscape now. And it's early, it's new technology. It seems to be working well where we're testing it. I know that it's on the roadmap for Australia. And I think it's pretty exciting to be able to kind of change the landscape in this way. When you think about it, the old version of a podcast with that ad just kind of hard-coded into it was kind of like a print ad in a magazine. You know, it was like you sent the thing out and you had no idea really who had listened to it or how many times it had been heard. You just knew it was downloaded and it was in the file. It may not have ever even been opened. But now streaming podcasts, instead of downloading them in the old way, we're able to actually have some more control over the full experience. And that includes how the ads are embedded in them.
To that end, we have another question about podcasts, particularly concerning measurement. So the question is, what are some unique ways you're looking to attribute podcast ad conversion? So to give some background on measurement, we're applying measurement and insights to podcasts in a similar way as we already have had measurement for music. So, for example, the industry standard that you see today in Australia and elsewhere is still downloads, which to Rich's point is a super redundant metric. Downloading a podcast, to Rich's point, is akin to buying a magazine. We don't know if you read it, but I guess we're grateful that you downloaded it. By contrast, we have a platform called podcasters.spotify.com where any creator with a podcast on Spotify can go in. They can see the demographic profile of their listeners. They can see starts and streams. Those are the two key metrics for consumption. And in terms of attribution within advertising, to what Rich said, streaming ad insertion, we'll see ads dynamically inserted into content, and we're going to have the same metrics around click-through, impression, and also profiling the people who actually took that action. It's not going to be, I've got a winning podcast with 10,000 downloads a week and nothing else, particularly for the advertiser. It's going to be really robust metrics in there, which in my opinion is cleaning up something of a mess, which is that very crowded and not attributable podcasting landscape. So I might take one more question and then close it out. So a question here, Ramiro asks, how can we contact Spotify to get quotes on different types of sound ads? Any type of ads that work better than others in terms of conversion or branding? So two things. At the end of this, you're going to see a slide with my email on it. Send me that email, and I'll be very happy to put you into touch with our production partner who can talk to you about different types of sound and quotations for that. The second part of the question about what works better is something that we're still investigating. We want to know, is it better to have a music bed or maybe to just have a straight read in some instances? The efficacy of a call to action rather than having something which doesn't specifically tell the person to do something. So this is an area that we're still investigating. And if you've come to this session, you can expect to be on our mailing list. So we'll be sharing those insights when they become available. And with that, I think we've exhausted all of the questions that I at least am qualified to answer. So we might close this one out. If we can just move on to the next slide, please, Marco. There we go. So, getting ahead of myself again. So thank you very much for joining Rich and I this morning. And thank you, Rich, for making me feel incredibly inadequate with your enormous biography. You will all be receiving an email following this session containing our brand new loveAudio guide to audio creativity. I also encourage you to check out Spotify for Creatives, where you can find more insights and case studies. And as I said a moment ago, here's my contact. Please do get in touch if you have anything at all you want to know, from the interesting to the mundane. We're very happy to speak to you. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Rich, and have a good morning.